Okay, I think we are actually going to get going. So welcome to our session on the DPI Map, which is really an effort to try to wrap our heads a little bit around what is the size and the scope of what's happening in DPI around the world. That vibrated. So the first thing is this project really is trying to create a kind of global view of the state of DPI. And it emerged out of some conversations that were being had by a number of stakeholders in the ecosystem, especially in the lead up to the 50 in 5 campaign, where people are like, let's do 50 DPIs in 50 countries in 5 worlds. And I was like, that sounds super compelling. I love that narrative. But what is the current end? Like, how many DPIs currently exist? And nobody had really any sense of that. You know, so everybody would say India and Estonia, and then we started to say Brazil, and then it would go quiet. And I knew that the number of DPIs was probably larger than that because I've become quite close to the team at the Nordic Institute for Interoperable Standards, which is the organization that oversees the X-Road in Estonia. And I knew that they were aware of at least 19 X-Road deployments around the world. So I was like, I don't know if those are going to be considered DPI, but there's a lot more going on, and I'm sure there's still more going on top of that. So that led to this kind of idea of like, we should try to do some sort of inventory of what's happening in the world. And inventory didn't sound like a very interesting word, but map is very compelling. So I said, let's do a DPI map, of which, like, up until now, I will confess, we've not actually had a map, but that's about to change. So it was really just a spreadsheet, but we call it inventory. I see I skipped over. Before I go any further, there are a bunch of people who've helped make this happen. And so part of this is like generous funding from CoDevelop, which was spearheaded and handled by Jordan, who's also been an active contributor on this project. And then Christina, Kasim, and Julia, along with a few other people, have been instrumental in doing the research to make this all possible. And none of this would be happening without them. And just because sometimes they're shy, but Christina is like sitting right there. And she doesn't necessarily want to be seen, but she should be seen because she is doing so much work to make this possible. And if you want to talk to someone who loves to nerd out on DPI and really talk about what's going on, she is 100% a person to talk to. You should wave, Christina. I'm going to make you. Yes, right on. This is good. You don't get to be not seen. So shy maybe, but go and corner her. Done amazing work, and is really kind of the project manager and driver of a lot of this work. The other thing I want to say before I go any further is, while we have tried to go and source data ourselves, we also know that there's an incredible ecosystem of people out there that are also trying to do this work, often in kind of more sectoral focus. And we've been enormously helped by these organizations and many, many individuals whose permission I did not necessarily have to put up on a slide, so I did not use that in a slide, but many, many individuals who spent hours on the phone with us, walking us through reports they had written or other things whose data we use and we cite wherever possible. So I just want to be really clear, this is a team effort, not merely an IAPP effort or just that team. There's a huge numbers of people who have come together, who've done research that's making this all possible, and I just really want to acknowledge that. Okay, the first thing I want to do is, was I supposed to do something else on room check, or is it just to get here? Yeah, so I want to do an experiment, which is, if you have a phone, if you can take a look at this QR code, I'm like kind of like, as a lecturer and teacher, I'm like very mixed on Slido and using these things, but I'm like keen to see if the technology has matured and if we're doing better, and I want to do some surveys, because I think we have some interesting data, and I want to know what you all think. Like, our whole map is to try to expose that there's interesting data out there, but what are the conceptions that people have? So please take a look at that. Type in this code. I'm going to give everybody a few seconds, and and immediately you should start filling out the survey questions that you see once you type in that code. It's going to drop you in. It's going to ask you a question. Are some of you not having any love? It's coming. Okay, excellent. It's only all of the Netflix watching that's happening in other sessions right now that is making your connection slow. I'm going to give you a few seconds, download the questions, and then just answer. Only 3 questions, shouldn't take you very long. Oh, it's 1 question at a time. Oh, yeah, okay, sorry. The questions will happen as we move the slides. Thank you. Okay, hopefully you've all answered the first question. So our first question was, of the 210 countries in the world, how many do you think have DPI-like identity systems? And the correct answer is 34%. Right, so that's our first, which, like, I think if you started like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, people were like, I don't know, there's 5 countries, like 10 countries, maybe 12 countries that have some sort of like digital ID system. The number is much, much, much higher than that. Okay, on to our next question. Hopefully it's being prompted to you. Oh, look, there we go. See, here we're giving you the right answer before you got to vote. That's terrible. The latecomers get to make better decisions. But how many countries have DPI-like payment systems? About 27%. Again, much higher than just saying, oh yeah, like there's Brazil and there's a few others out there. There's the UPI, there's Pix. Like, there's a much higher number of them going on out there. And then let's go to our final question, which is how many have DPI-like data exchanges? I'm going to go back before anyone can like see what the right answer is. Yeah, Paul.
I'm just curious, does Safaricom's M-Pesa count?
Great question, Paul. Favorite case study question I like to use when I'm in classrooms with students is, actually let's do a quick search. Who thinks that M-Pesa is a DPI? Raise your hand if you think M-Pesa is a DPI. Who thinks M-Pesa is not a DPI? Now, who's not voting? Many of you are not voting. Yeah, you're not voting. You're like, what's M-Pesa? That's like a different question. So M-Pesa is a digital payment system run by Safaricom, which is a cell phone provider in in Kenya. And it is not a DPI. And the reason it's not a DPI is it has many of the, it looks like it's universal, it's a payment system, it allows you to do payments digitally, but one of the key parts of being digital public infrastructure is that public element. And so what makes you public is in our indicators is there a public interest entity that is providing oversight or operational capacity for that infrastructure? And in M-Pesa's case, it is entirely privately owned. It's entirely privately run. I mean, we can get into nuances. I know the Kenyan government now owns like 40% of Safaricom, so that's like, but they're not exercising control through that ownership. So it is digital private infrastructure, not digital public infrastructure. So it's a wonderful question, and I think it teases apart some of the things we're trying to get at in this map and figure out, okay, what is the total size of this versus what exists in the world? So I love that question, Paul. Thank you. So here you can see, again, many of you are maybe starting to clue in that the top answer is the right answer. But of the data exchanges, how many countries have DPI-like data exchanges? We have 17% as the dominant answer. But that's not necessarily always the right answer. So the green is not necessarily, it's just the dominant. Here are the actual numbers of countries that we have discovered so far. And I have many caveats I'm going to share that will qualify these numbers. We reserve to have the right for these numbers to go up and down. In fact, just this morning, I was having an amazing conversation with our colleagues sitting at the front table here from Indonesia. They have a very intriguing digital identity system that is not reflected in our data because we were not able to find it in the research we were doing, but that does not mean it does not exist. But the point here is the 27% for data exchange is not right. It's actually a much, much higher number. So the first thing that I think is interesting about these is there's a lot more going on around DPI in the world than people thought, like a significantly greater amount. But also, it depends on what you choose as your definition for DPI that will also help drive these numbers. There's an enormous vagueness about what qualifies as DPI. So even here with these ones, to our best knowledge, these are active in operation. That's not always easy for us to test. They're actually facilitating authentication, and they're operational across 2 use cases. So for us, like a DPI you can't have like a digital ID that's only working for a single social benefit. You have to have an implementation that's working across 2 sectors as kind of a test for us about whether this is actually infrastructure and not a bespoke solution for a given ministry. So that's what we're trying to test in those. And I won't read these slides, but on the digital payments that are DPI-like, you've got to be facilitating real-time transactions, and you've got to have a public interest entity that's providing oversight or operational capacity. And for us at the moment, that broadly means we're looking for, is there central bank oversight or ownership of that system? It's conceivable that you could have a different type of public interest entity, harder for us to discern, but that's kind of what's guiding our metrics on this. And the data exchange, data exchanges are the hardest to define. And in our definition too, we're looking mostly at data exchanges that are kind of society-wide. We are not looking at, say, healthcare-specific data exchanges, of which that number would probably explode even more if you started to look at those. So even our definition here is relatively narrow, but data exchange is such a loose term and it covers so much ground that there's a lot of those going on. I want to be clear, not all those data exchanges are Estonia-like, every piece of information in government is moving across. That's 100% not the case. It just exists. It may only be sharing 3 pieces of data across 2 ministries. It would still qualify as a data exchange in our assessment. So I always like to say, we're trying to evaluate if there's a road in place. We're not looking at how much traffic is on that road. So do you have a DPI, do you not have a DPI is more kind of a binary. Its effectiveness, we are not judging. Okay, so this is maybe like the big slide that people always really want to see because it provides a high-level snapshot overview of what's going on. If you would like to, I would strongly encourage you at least now to this QR code will take you to the DPI map. You can head over there and then you can, do you want to add something? In 20 minutes? Oh, I have 20 minutes. Oh, okay, sorry. This is no, you should head over there. And we'd love actually for you to take a look at your own country's data and tell us if you think it's accurate. And if it's not, I think we have at least 7 places on our website where we have calls for action for you to tell us how to improve our data. Because we know it's not perfect. It's the best that we're able to do. Okay. So how our journey here, just so you understand how we got to these and some of the caveats I'm going to talk about. The first is, we did a whole bunch of desk research to figure out how people were defining DPI, what were the attributes that they thought made up DPI, and we did a whole number of interviews of experts in the field because we didn't want to just be like, what's our definition, let's use it. We tried to really look at what the UN had written, what the World Bank had written, what the Gates Foundation had written, what the Indians had written, what the Estonians had written. So we did all this desk research to figure out how would we start to try to define what DPI is. Did a bunch of expert interviews and consultations. This included running online seminars about payments, identity, and data exchanges, each one where we pulled in implementers, people who are deploying these, government experts, and technical experts, as well as CSOs, like nonprofits who were doing advocacy work for or against these types of systems to kind of get their views about how they were defining it. And this was because for us, we didn't just want a technical definition of what is the technology, but what is the governance that needs to be in place. So digital public infrastructure is not just can you provide an identity, it's what is the governance that's wrapped around that. And out of that came 42 indicators that we evaluate when we're looking at whether or not your country has a DPI or not. And then in June, we did a whole bunch of research and we looked at 132 countries that in June we launched. That was our V1. And some of you were online. I recognize some of you were online for that. That was a great success. And that finished to kind of our version 1 of our framework and our conceptualization and measurement methodology. And now today, we're launching our map with a total global data set of 220 countries. And that's what those numbers represent. In addition to that, we actually now have a map that you can go look at on our website. So you can look and you can click in on a country and you can see what they had. Before, we just had a spreadsheet, so the map was kind of a lie. The map is no longer a lie, and this is kind of exciting to us. When we did this work, we had 4 types of users in mind. So we had fellow researchers, we really see the map as a way of creating a baseline set of data that other researchers can use to figure out what's going on in the DPI space around the world. We also imagined that there were governments that were thinking about doing DPI, or maybe even had some, but were thinking about expanding it or wanting to gather lessons. And the map would allow them to see who their peers are. Who else is doing what they're doing? Could they find peers to learn from or to exchange kind of lessons with? And then we knew that there were builders out there like open source communities, proprietary vendors that are building and deploying, technical advisors that are deploying DPIs, and that they would want to have a sense of what was happening so they could also learn, but also like maybe do business development around. And then finally, we're also very interested in the kind of what we call advocates, which are anything from those trying to promote DPIs to those like civil society organizations, human rights groups that are kind of like trying to figure out what good governance looks like and how that should be formed in their countries. And so we thought our map would be helpful to them to see what's happening in other places around the world as, again, benchmarking data to help them be more effective advocates in their country. Maybe just really quickly, I know we have, one of the exciting things that happened during this mapping process is we've had over 21, 22 different organizations reach out to us and tell us that they are using our mapping data to help in their research. And some of them are in this room right now. And so maybe just really quickly, I won't give you a mic or anything, but Jacob, Jacob's from Brookings. Do you want to stand up and just speak loudly, tell us like how you're using the map at Brookings? Okay. Oh, it's nice.
Christina's got a map for me. Hi everyone, map users. So yeah, as David said, I'm a fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings, and generally speaking, we work on how to achieve the SDGs. And so we think about issues like extreme deprivation, social exclusion, climate and development finance, and so on. And this year we're doing a series of roundtables with Co-Develop on the role of DPI in enabling some specific SDG issues. And the first roundtable is on ending extreme poverty and the role of digital cash transfers now that there's kind of global confidence in the evidence base around that. So we were very excited by the DPI map as a way to set up this discussion in the policy world. So for us, it was a very important grounding tool on digital readiness in countries. So if you can figure out where countries are at in terms of their basic digital infrastructure, then you can think about how to get cash through that infrastructure to people in extreme poverty. And so there are about 700 million people in extreme poverty at the moment. If you think about countries that have, 700 million. If you think about countries that have greater than 3% of their population in poverty, extreme poverty, then you're getting to around 500, 600 million. And so we had a look at that subset of countries and where their digital infrastructure was in terms of payments primarily, getting money to people, digital ID, and we kind of left data exchange off for now just because our priorities were around unconditional direct cash transfers. So the great thing about DPI Map is that we're talking about DPI, but what it really gives you is a nice spectrum of nothing at all that we know, all the way through to kind of gold star DPI across those three layers. And so we were able to subset 3 groups of countries. We found that 8 countries with extreme poverty, persistent extreme poverty, had kind of DPI gold standard ready to go across payment and digital ID. And so the exciting outcome for us is that if you think about it, in principle, tomorrow we could actually lift about 150 million people out of extreme poverty through that DPI-ready infrastructure. And so when we're at a global policy level thinking about how to mobilize political will and finance for these SDG issues, that's a really powerful insight straight off the bat. And it disarms a lot of the arguments that, we're not ready yet to do this type of thing. In fact, 8 countries representing over 150 million people in extreme poverty, in principle, we could use DPI tomorrow to do that. And then the second bucket was a bucket of 50 countries that represent about 350 million people in extreme poverty, where they have some form of DPI in motion. So it's a plan, it's a pilot, it's not quite gold standard yet and in operational according to the definitions that David put out, but it is on its way. And again, that's a really interesting space for us to ask, how much DPI do we need to get moving? Or maybe the better question for us is, a lot of countries have some form of infrastructure. What would be the added additional return on investment if you did it DPI? And so that's really where like the arguments from Pramod and others, and Nandan and so on, about the benefits of doing horizontal society-wide infrastructure versus just building stovepipe solutions for cash transfers. And we really want to use that as a basis for our roundtable discussion. The third category, just very quickly, about 9 countries where we don't have much information about their digital infrastructure, but their extreme poverty is a real acute concern. And so for that bucket of 9 countries, it's like, how does the global community help those countries get on their DPI journey? So yeah, that's just a quick insight. Thank you. Thank you for the map. It was great. Thank you, Christina, for being so generous with your time. We asked a bunch of technical questions of the DPI map to Christina, and she was very accommodating. So I appreciate all the work of the team.
Thank you. So for me, like a really wonderful example of like some of the people that have written to us and reached out to us. We've had 22 organizations reach out to us and say, hey, here's how we're using this. And they kind of come to us for different reasons. Some of them come to us because they have like questions about data accuracy, and our team gets on the phone, engages them, works with them. And if they actually are finding things that we're missing, like we feel very good about our data, but we're very humble about our data. So many people know more than we do, and so if you call us and you have insights that we don't have, we'd love to make our data more accurate, and we know that many people out there have access to data that we don't. And so if we can incorporate, that's great. Sometimes they tell us like, hey, like my conversation with our Indonesian colleagues today, they're like, hey, you're missing something. There's a new deployment that you didn't know about, and so we get to add that, and that's very helpful. Sometimes they want to talk to us about new metrics and ways to measure DPI, and sometimes they have additional data sources we can be drawing on. I think the big thing about those conversations is it's validated a whole bunch of ideas and concepts that we were hoping to test with the map. So the one is that there is like beginnings to think about conceptualization and measurement of DPI, and if we can build a community that's thinking about how to measure these things, there is real value to that. And part of my hope actually is that the DPI map both causes more research into measurement of DPI and also maybe causes governments to be more proactive in sharing data about DPI. Like now they want to be on our map, and so they'll become more proactive about sharing that data. It confirmed a bunch of speculations we had that there was a lot more DPI going on in the world than people thought. And it also disproved some hypotheses. And then it really does, though, highlight the need for better data. Like our data is far from perfect. It is very hard to do this work. It's very, very hard to drill down. And there's all sorts of caveats that we have. So some of those are here, but just to kind of like share, like we broadly believe governments. So when a government says it's doing something, we generally believe it until we have evidence that shows us that's not true. But many governments do actually make claims that they say we have a digital ID or we have a data exchange, and sometimes those claims are made and then the work stopped and the project never actually launched, and it's very hard for us to discern that, particularly for data exchanges, which are often behind kind of a firewall and maybe just sharing data between ministry, and there's no user interface where you could even begin to easily assess that. So it's a particularly challenging one, but it's true too for digital identities, and so there may be data we have where we say something exists, but actually in truth it barely exists or it doesn't exist, which is why we reserve the right for this number to go down. And in part, we're relying on local experts to come to us, and we're reaching out to them to try to validate that. We're kind of limited to kind of desk research, so we try to do interviews where we can, but we're not going into every country and testing this stuff ourselves. And I just really want to acknowledge the limits around our methodology, which we document in extreme detail on our website. The other thing is just like from the methodology that we used, we did come up with a huge number of indicators. Some of them were kind of like measurable, but there's a bunch of indicators we think are important out there that are actually just very, very hard to measure. And you have to be super careful in doing this work in that it has to be a binary measurable thing. It has to be, you can either say it exists or it doesn't exist. This gray area where there's a lot of judgment, I do not want to be in the business of getting on the phone with 100 governments and explain to them why we said they did not have this capability or they did not meet this criteria. Because especially if I'm bringing a lens of like, oh, I'm not sure it's good enough. we have to have very clear binary decisions here. So for example, we ask the question of, does the country have a privacy law? That's a binary. You either have one or you don't have one. We say nothing about the quality of that privacy law. That becomes a much more difficult and sometimes subjective or at least value-based place where you'd be coming from. Nothing would please me more, though, than to have a nonprofit, a CSO, or an organization look at our data and then do their own analysis and build their own kind of dashboard on top of our data that says, here are the countries that have privacy laws, and here is our evaluation of the quality of those privacy laws. Like, the whole point of the data is to enable that research to take place on top of it. There's just limits of what we can do. So I think one key thing here is we've got to get really careful about, am I out of time? Yeah. So we're all, like, I'll get there. So, but the key thing here is, like, it is really, this work is made very, very difficult because the lack of clear definitions make it hard. So our indicators are really kind of a way of looking along a spectrum of what is happening to what's not happening. At no point do we make kind of clear roles about what is DPI, what's not DPI. We're more trying to kind of create a set of indicators and allowing others to assess whether you think something is DPI or not. But we think all of the indicators we have are at least pretty important, and there's no country on the planet that satisfies all of them. Maybe kind of on a subtext, I'd say, I don't want our map to be used as a floor that you clear to become DPI. I want it to be used as a ceiling that everybody is marching towards, and maybe over time our methodology actually become more robust and more demanding, and we can create like a virtual spiral upwards towards what good DPI looks like, as opposed to some minimum floor that once countries clear, they're like, I'm done, and I don't have to do any more work, when almost certainly there's always more work to be done to drive trust, inclusion, and safety. Okay, maybe I'm gonna blow through these slides relatively quickly, but one of the things that we really love doing is actually trying to paint a picture to people about why not everything is a DPI, and where, what are these funnels where like people kind of fall off the map and stop being DPI. One thing that I think is really interesting about this is it does also show us that there's this tantalizing possibility, as Jacob was talking about kind of proto-DPIs being out there. Countries that have some things in place, but not all the things in place. And that's a great place to be, because that means like the funders, the finance ministries can then say, oh, we have something to build off of. And so these slides kind of show you like people who are claiming to have digital IDs, ones that are just actually in rollout phases, so we exclude those. Do they actually have an authentication mechanism, which is often the most useful thing you can do with a digital ID? And are they being used in 2 use cases? So are they in 2 sectors? So you can see here the total number of countries on the planet and how we end up at 57, and where you're kind of losing people on the journey towards DPI-ness. So I won't go through all of these in detail, but we have these for both payments and data exchange, and they'll all be up on our website for you to kind of go and explore, and it helps you understand how we arrived at our numbers. Maybe the other thing that was like, we're starting to do some analysis that we're going to be posting in the next few weeks on this data as well. And so one thing too is like, there is some interesting things going on around kind of different levels of income in countries. And so if you look at like payment systems where you have like all the countries in the world, and you're just looking at kind of like the dark blue represents kind of like those that are run interbank but are kind of not public interest run, versus the ones that are, actually the first one is all of them, and the second ones are the ones that are public interest run. So the far one there shows you that's the DPI. These are the total number of payment systems in the world. And then the light blue represents those that are cross-domain, which means you can make payments across multiple players. And that for me is like also a really important condition for DPI, is that you're not locking into a kind of single network or into a single company. And you can see there's a lot of DPI out there, but the numbers that are cross-domain aren't that many, but there's more of them in emerging markets than there are in mature markets. So there's actually more DPI-like activity happening in emerging markets than there is in mature markets. There's more that's actually run by a public interest entity that's maybe got development and inclusion as a driver goal of its mission, and they're doing more cross-sectoral payment to make it more inclusive and more accessible to more of their population than just those in a single bank network or on a single app network. I think this is a very, very interesting finding, and it again lends credence to this notion that more interesting things are happening in emerging markets, and we should be listening to them a lot more than necessarily the OECD countries. There are also some like distinct regional patterns that are going on around there. So if you look at systems like data exchange systems, you can see like Europe is now done very well on our map because we didn't have them in the first version. And it's in part because the Europeans are trying very hard to create data exchange systems within the European Union. There are also a lot of countries in Europe, so North America doesn't look so great, but there's actually not that many countries, says the North American in the room, slightly defensively. But you can see here, like, there's this huge, there's a lot that's going on in Africa and Asia, and there's a decent amount that's going on in Latin America, and there's also this, like, real range of what types of vendors or systems they're using. But what's interesting is X-Road and UXP are, I think, effectively the same. UXP is a private fork of X-Road. So you can see like how powerful the X-Road platform is around the world and how many countries are adopting it. Okay, with that, maybe I'll open up things to questions and see if people have feedback or thoughts. If you're looking at our map and you're already seeing problems, we do want to hear about it, but I want to kind of like lean towards questions more in this session. But please come approach us afterwards or book in a meeting with us on our website so we can sit down and talk with you over Zoom. Any questions or thoughts? Or yes, at the very back, sir.
Hi. It's not a question, it's more of a compliment. I was actually searching for some content like this because when we were looking at posting some of the content on digital ID, because I am coming from Ironworks where we have implemented DPGs and DPIs in a couple of countries. But it was going monotonous when we were publishing content. So then I told my team, what we should actually publish for the ID Day, which happened on 16th of September, what is the progress in DPIs across the world? And we came across the same report which you showcased. And that is where things have changed for us. And that funnel gives us a clear clarity where the action is happening. And like what you said, it's the emerging markets which are doing the digital transformation. And for companies like us, it makes it interesting to target those countries. And interestingly, India has around 12 DPI products. And for me, surprising was Oman, which is next to India, which was 9 DPI products which has been rolled out. I think rest of them around 5 or 6 majorly. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the report.
So I want to fully acknowledge that Jake was definitely a plant. But this gentleman was not a plant. This is very exciting for us. So thank you so much. And it's great to hear that this is useful to you. And I think like sometimes people ask us like, well, why do you care about private sectors and SIs? It's because we're probably not going to scale DPI worldwide unless we draw in some private capital to help do this. So it's so great to see even those actors finding this useful. Professor McNaughton, I think I saw your hand up. Or did Mike already go? Oh, yeah, or Shrikar, sorry, I don't... Oh,
yeah, thanks, David. Just a really quick question. The conceptualization of DPIs around these 3 core pillars, identity, payments, and data exchange, is that normative by any means, or this is just what has emerged? And I've just taken those as sort of the 3 core things that represent DPI.
Yeah, there's a whole other debate about what DPI is that I think is kind of like, there's a definite DPI, which is what are some core capabilities that a state should have in order to be effective in the 21st century. And I think there is general agreement that if you are a functioning state, you need to have some way to help citizens assert who they are. You need some way to enable the exchange of value. And you probably need some way to exchange data to provision services. And that these are effectively modern state capabilities that need to exist. And so that is, I think, one definition of infrastructure. There's another definition of infrastructure, which is more like, we should just be reusing things as we build. I think that I like both definitions in that the reuse, it's a process on which reuse is important. I agree with, and I see these as kind of core building blocks that you would want to reuse in order to facilitate DPI. I think my challenge with the DPI as an approach is it becomes very hard to measure and it becomes very hard to quantify what it is. And even a player like AWS or Microsoft could say, well, we have nothing but microservices across our platform that you can use. Many of them are open source. Well, let's just call AWS a DPI. And I'm not sure that we would necessarily feel comfortable with that. So I think there is work to be done on that. But I agree that it's probably going to be more than those three, but where it ends is less clear to me. But let's at least start with like what we think are core state functions that need to exist. And I think, yes.
Hey, David. Yeah, so thanks for the map. So when we started looking at this data in 2022, it was a mix of DIAL's database and World Bank's GovTech Maturity Index and a bunch of those. And I think what we were able to use it for is in the Safeguards initiative to try and get a sense of which countries are aware of DPI, which countries are actually implementing or have rolled out something at scale. Because talking about safeguards and advancing anything that's DPI plus requires them to be thinking about DPI in the first place. So it was super useful from that perspective. And I also realized while going through it in the earlier phases of when you shared it with us, it's also an interesting learning tool to work through different theories of change. So for example, the question about authentication, like you said, 70 countries around the world, 70% of the countries around the world claim to have digital ID systems, but they don't mean a lot unless they're authenticating. And that's the value of the DPI ID system.
Yeah.
So just having people go through those attributes and get a sense of what we mean or what is meant by a fast payment system. Why is it important? Why is it different from an M-Pesa or so on? I think so there's a lot of value in that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so glad that Arthur Globals found this tool useful. And thank you for that contribution. Yeah, at the very back over there, and then I see the lady over there also has her hand up. Right over there.
Hi, thanks so much. Charles Weatherill from United Nations Capital Development Fund. Maybe picking up on the previous question, you mentioned that you're not here to talk about sort of the volume of traffic on the highway, just what's present, what's not. But maybe I could ask you to kind of go a little bit farther on that topic. And taking specifically the example of M-Pesa, there's a tremendous volume of financial payments happening in Kenya through M-Pesa, and there really is no rival or alternative. But I guess the question is, how do you see that? Is that a problem? Should there be a public alternative? Or is the notion of DPI here in terms of payments that there's a public complement to what is available through the private sector?
Yeah, great question. So maybe let me double click a little bit on this. So one thing is, one reason why I'm nervous about assessing the traffic on the road, if you will, is that I don't know what the policy objectives of the country are. The policy objectives of the country may have been just to move data between three ministries. And the fact that it's doing that, all the stakeholders are happy, it's accomplished its mission. And from an outsider, you're like, well, I thought you wanted to be Estonia, and you just have these two data sets moving across three ministries. Like, this is a failure. Meanwhile, they're like, no, this did exactly what we wanted it to do, and we're really happy, and maybe in the future we'll build on it. And so I want to be very careful about making judgments about what good looks like, and not impose my own vision of what good looks like. But we do try to create, again, some minimum layers. Like, you have to have, to be infrastructure, it can't be bespoke. It's got to have at least two players on it. So we try to create some minimum levels, but be careful about too much judgment. I think the deeper thing about your question about, is M-Pesa good or not? I think M-Pesa is great. I think Venmo is great. For non-Americans, Venmo is like a payment system in America where when I originally did not know about, my students almost rebelled on me because I moved from Canada, because it doesn't exist in Canada, right? So Venmo is great. Any way of exchanging money is great. The question is I've actually written a case study on M-Pesa versus UPI, so can really nerd out, but the bigger question is, over the longer run, are you creating a choke point where there's a winner-take-all piece of private infrastructure in your ecosystem or in your economy where the opportunity to extract rents or snuff out competition at other layers of your economy start to present themselves as being advantageous to that player? And what are the mechanisms by which you want to deal with that? And there are many. You could choose competition policy, you could fund other competing networks. And the DPI approach is to say, no, let's create an open protocol, and we're going to commoditize and open up this layer of the stack to enable competition to take place theoretically on layers above as another way of dealing with competition. And so I think the Kenyans should do what works best for Kenya. And if that means building a DPI, then they should build a DPI. But if they think that they can actually just regulate M-Pesa and the volume is great and they can avoid rent extraction and they can avoid all the other problems, then there may be a non-DPI solution that is completely appropriate. And I don't think it's my place to really say, you should be doing this or you should be doing that. All I want to do is measure whether it's a DPI or not. And in our case, M-Pesa is not a DPI. A great question. I believe the lady at the very back. And then last question, and then we'll stop.
Hi, thanks. This is Anita here. I have 2 points. The one is, I think when we were doing the poll, the numbers came that ID had 34%, then the data exchange was 17%. But when we looked at the countries, it was 103 countries. And if we say that there are 210 countries in the world, then and 103 countries have a data exchange platform, how come it was 17%, which was the correct answer?
Oh, no, 17% was not the right answer. I was misreading it. So the green was just what the majority chose. Okay. It was not actually the right answer. So that's on me. That's on me. Okay. But actually what's interesting is many people chose 17% when the right answer was a much, much larger number.
Okay. And the second, that's where I go, because I think the way what I've been hearing here, for the payment DPI, since you're a professor, I'm saying your cutoff is very high. You're saying M-Pesa doesn't qualify. But when it comes to data exchange, the DPI concept is not well defined. The data exchange concept is not well defined. You suddenly lower your bar too low, and that's why 103 countries qualify, which is really not the case that you have data exchange happening in 103 countries. Even if I do a sample dip check, just two systems exchanging data via API, it would be not a public infrastructure which qualifies from a systems architect perspective. I feel your bar is too high in one place.
Too low in the other?
Yeah, too low on the other.
So I love this comment, and I think one of the things is our goal in releasing this data is for others to come along and write those exact things and say, well, if I was going to say where I thought the bar should be, I think the bar should be these places, and there the numbers would look like this. So I don't see our high-level numbers of what the number of DPIs out there as the definitive answer. It is an opinion that emerges out of a set of consultations and work that we did, but nothing would please me more than to have other people come along and say, no, David, Christina, Kasim, you are wrong. The number should actually be this, and I interpret your data this way. That would be an amazing outcome. So please write that and send it to us, and we will also share with the world your thoughts. I know there's incredible pressure for time here, so I'm going to quietly move off stage, but just want to say thank you so much for coming to our session. And if you have questions, with so many calls to action on our website, come book time with us. Thanks so much, everyone.
Hey, everybody. Just a quick announcement that the next session will start at 11 o'clock. And so if you stay in this room, it will be the Applied Learning Workshop on DPI governance with David Eves. But there's other workshops also taking place. If you need help finding a location, you can ask me, or you can ask an usher as well. So 11 o'clock is the next session. Thank you.